Hi, I'm Jessica Torres. Last Tuesday, my parents called to tell me they were giving my childhood bedroom to my cousin Kevin's family for the summer. Not asking me, telling me. Because apparently, at 28 years old, successful marketing, executive with my own apartment, I was still expected to sleep on the living room couch whenever I visited. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But here's what they didn't know. 3 weeks earlier, I'd purchased their house at a foreclosure auction. They were about to become my tenants. The call came while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my corner office overlooking downtown Phoenix. The Arizona sun was blazing through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across my mahogany desk. I should have known something was wrong when Mom's contact photo lit up my phone at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Patricia Torres. Never called during business hours unless someone was in the hospital or she needed money. "Jessica, honey," she started, using that syrupy tone that always preceded bad news wrapped in false sweetness. "I wanted to let you know that Kevin and Lisa are coming to stay with us for a few weeks this summer. You know how hard things have been for them since Kevin lost his job at the auto plant." I leaned back in my leather chair, already sensing where this conversation was heading. Kevin Martinez, my cousin, had always been the golden child in our extended family. 2 years older than me, he'd gotten married young, had 3 kids by 25, and somehow convinced everyone that his series of failed business ventures and job losses were just temporary setbacks rather than a pattern of poor decision-making. "That's nice of you to help them out," I replied carefully, saving the document on my computer screen. "Are they staying in the guest room?" The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. It was the same loaded silence that had preceded countless childhood disappointments. The pause before being told that family vacation was canceled because money was tight. The pause before learning that my college fund had been borrowed to help Uncle Carlos with his mortgage. The pause that meant Jessica's needs came last, again. "Well, that's the thing, sweetheart. Kevin and Lisa have the 3 kids, and you know how cramped that guest room gets. We thought it would be better if they took your room since it has more space and the kids would be more comfortable." My grip tightened on the phone. "My room?" "Oh, Jessica, don't be dramatic. You have your own place now. You hardly ever visit anyway. And when you do come by, the couch in the living room is perfectly comfortable. You're always saying how you don't sleep much anyway because of work." There it was, the casual dismissal disguised as practicality. The way my parents had perfected the art of making their selfishness sound like logic. I stared out at the Phoenix skyline, watching the heat shimmer rise from the concrete below, and felt something cold settle in my chest. "So you're giving away my childhood bedroom to Kevin's family without even asking me how I feel about it?" "Asking you?" Mom's voice sharpened slightly, dropping some of its artificial sweetness. "Jessica, you're nearly 30 years old. You can't expect us to keep a shrine to your teenage years forever. Kevin's family needs the space, and frankly, it's about time you stopped acting like you still live here." I closed my eyes and counted to 5, a technique I'd learned in therapy to manage the rage that always bubbled up during conversations with my parents. Dr. Chen had warned me that setting boundaries with family members who'd spent decades ignoring them would be challenging. She'd been right. "I never said I still lived there, Mom. But it's still my room. My trophies are in there, my books, my—" "Your junk, you mean," she interrupted. "Half of those boxes haven't been touched in years. Maybe this will finally motivate you to come get your things and stop using our house as free storage." The cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. Not just the words, but the tone. The complete dismissal of 28 years of memories, of achievements, of the life I'd built despite their constant undermining. I thought about my debate team trophies sitting on the shelf above my desk. The books I'd read late into the night, dreaming of the life I was building beyond the suffocating expectations of Scottsdale suburbia. The acceptance letters from colleges, They'd pressured me not to attend because it would be too expensive and too far from family. "When are they moving in?" I asked quietly. "This weekend. Kevin's driving down from Flagstaff on Saturday. I know it's short notice, but it's fine," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "I understand completely." Mom seemed taken aback by my lack of resistance. She'd been prepared for a fight, armed with guilt trips and accusations of selfishness. My easy acceptance threw her off balance. "Oh, well, good. I'm glad you're being mature about this. Kevin really appreciates the support, and you know how Uncle Carlos worries about them." Uncle Carlos. Dad's older brother who'd somehow convinced my parents that his son's problems were everyone else's responsibility. The same man who'd borrowed $15,000 from my college fund 12 years ago and still hadn't paid it back. The same man who'd guilt-tripped my parents into co-signing Kevin's car loan, his credit cards, his failed business ventures. "I'm sure Kevin appreciates it," I said. "Listen, Mom, I have to run. Big presentation this afternoon." "Of course you do. Work always comes first with you, doesn't it?" "Well, don't be a stranger. Maybe you can come by this weekend and help Kevin's family get settled." Help them get settled. In my room. Using my childhood desk, sleeping in my bed, rearranging the space that held every memory of who I'd been before I learned to build walls around my heart. "We'll see," I said, and ended the call. I sat in my office for a long time after that, watching the sun move across the Phoenix Valley. The city sprawled endlessly in every direction, a testament to what happened when people refused to accept limitations. I'd moved here 8 years ago, fresh out of Arizona State with a marketing degree and exactly $3,000 in my checking account. My parents had called it running away. I'd called it survival. The drive from Phoenix to Scottsdale usually took 45 minutes, but that evening I took the long way, winding through desert roads that gave me time to think. The saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels against the coral-pink sunset, and I found myself remembering the first time Dad had explained how they survived in such harsh conditions. "They're tougher than they look, Jessie," he'd said when I was maybe 8 years old. "They don't need much water because they've learned to store what they need deep inside. Sometimes being independent is the only way to survive." I'd loved that story as a child, not realizing it was prophetic. Dad had no idea he was describing exactly what his daughter would need to become. My phone buzzed with a text from Brianna, my college roommate, and the closest thing I had to a sister. She lived in Los Angeles now, working as a talent agent, but we'd maintained our friendship despite the distance. "Coffee tomorrow? I'm driving through Phoenix for a client meeting," I texted back quickly. "Yes, need to vent about family drama." "The Torres family circus strikes again. I'll bring wine instead of coffee." Brianna had witnessed enough family gatherings during our college years to understand the dynamics. She'd been the one to suggest I consider the marketing program at ASU instead of staying local. She'd been the one to help me move out of my parents' house the weekend after graduation, loading boxes while Mom made passive-aggressive comments about young people being too eager to abandon their roots. That night, I sat in my downtown Phoenix apartment, a sleek one-bedroom loft in a converted warehouse building, and tried to focus on the presentation I needed to finish for the next day. But my mind kept drifting to Saturday morning, to Kevin and Lisa and their 3 kids taking over the space that had been mine for 18 years. I thought about the lavender walls I'd painted the summer before my senior year of high school, convincing Dad to let me redo the room because I'd saved up the money myself from my part-time job at the local bookstore. I thought about the window seat where I'd spent countless hours reading, dreaming about the day I'd be successful enough that no one could dismiss my feelings or treat my needs as optional. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd achieved that success. At 28, I was the youngest senior account manager at Morrison & Associates, one of Phoenix's most prestigious marketing firms. I owned my own car, paid my own rent, had built a life that required nothing from my parents except basic respect and acknowledgement. But somehow, I was still the one expected to sacrifice, to accommodate, to shrink myself down to whatever size was most convenient for everyone else. My laptop chimed with an email notification. The subject line made my stomach clench. Storage unit payment overdue. Torres family account. I opened it quickly, scanning the automated message. The storage unit in Scottsdale that my parents had been renting for the past 3 years was 2 months behind on payments. The final notice warned that the contents would be auctioned off if payment wasn't received within 10 days. I stared at the screen, processing the implications. My parents were behind on a $60 monthly storage payment. The same parents who'd just offered to house Kevin's family for an indefinite period. The same parents who'd always claimed they couldn't afford to help with my college expenses or car insurance when I was starting out. Something didn't add up. I grabbed my phone and called the storage facility. The night manager, a friendly woman named Sandra, confirmed what the email had said. The Torres family account was 60 days overdue, and they'd been unable to reach my parents despite multiple attempts. The weird thing is, Sandra added, we had your father in here about 6 months ago, and he seemed really stressed. Kept talking about having to liquidate assets, whatever that means. Nice man, but he looked like he hadn't been sleeping. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, pieces of a puzzle clicking together in my mind. Dad's stressed behavior, Mom's sudden urgency to make space in the house, the casual way they'd dismissed my attachment to my childhood room. I opened my laptop and navigated to the Maricopa County Public Records database, a resource I'd learned to use during my early days in marketing when I'd researched client companies. Property records were public information, accessible to anyone who knew where to look. I typed in my parents' address and waited for the results to load. What I found made my blood run cold. The house at 847 Desert Rose Drive, Scottsdale, Arizona, the house where I'd grown up, where my parents had lived for 32 years, was listed as pending foreclosure action. The first notice had been filed 4 months ago. The auction date was set for next Friday. Next Friday, 6 days away. I scrolled through the legal documents, my marketing brain automatically organizing the information into actionable insights. My parents were 3 months behind on their mortgage payments. The loan had been modified twice in the past 2 years, each time with less favorable terms. They owed $87,000 on a house that was worth maybe $180,000 in the current market. But here was the thing that made my hands shake as I typed. They hadn't told me. Their daughter, who worked in financial services marketing, who understood debt restructuring and foreclosure timelines, who had enough savings to help them navigate this crisis. They'd kept me in the dark while inviting Kevin's family to move into a house they were about to lose. I spent the next 3 hours researching everything I could find about their financial situation. Public records showed a pattern of financial strain going back years. Late property tax payments, a second mortgage taken out 18 months ago, a lien filed by a credit card company last summer. My parents were drowning, and instead of asking their successful daughter for help, they'd decided to pretend everything was fine while giving away my childhood bedroom to relatives who probably had no idea they were moving into a house that was about to be sold at auction. The rage I felt wasn't the hot, explosive kind. It was cold and calculating, the kind that came from years of being treated as expendable. They'd rather lose their house than admit to me that they needed help. They'd rather lie and manipulate than treat me as an adult capable of contributing to solutions. I looked up the auction details. Friday, 10 a.m., on the courthouse steps. Minimum bid, $87,000. I opened my banking app and looked at my account balances. Between savings, checking, and my investment portfolio, I had access to about $240,000 in liquid assets. Enough to buy the house outright and still have money left over. The idea formed slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. What if I didn't tell them about the foreclosure? What if I let them discover it the same way I had to discover that my room was being given away? What if, for once in my life, I held the cards and made the decisions? I spent the rest of the night researching foreclosure auctions, reading about investor strategies, understanding the legal implications of purchasing a property with existing tenants. By sunrise, I had a plan. On Wednesday morning, I called in sick to work. Instead of going to the office, I drove to a real estate attorney's office in Scottsdale. Margaret Henley had excellent reviews online and specialized in foreclosure purchases. Her assistant squeezed me in for a lunch appointment. Margaret was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes who reminded me of the debate coach who'd taught me to argue with facts instead of emotions. I explained the situation as clinically as possible, focusing on the legal aspects rather than the family drama. So you want to purchase your childhood home at foreclosure auction without telling your parents beforehand, she summarized. And they currently have house guests moving in this weekend who don't know about the foreclosure either. That's correct. She leaned back in her chair, studying me. I have to ask, what's your end goal here? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Revenge? Financial investment? Family reconciliation? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. Honestly, I think I want them to experience what it feels like to have important decisions made about their lives without their input. And I want to make sure the house stays in the family rather than going to some investor who'll flip it. Margaret nodded slowly. The foreclosure auction is legitimate. Your parents will receive notice of the sale, but often people don't understand what those notices mean until it's too late. If you purchase the property, you'll become their landlord. They can remain as tenants, but you'll have the legal right to set the terms. She walked me through the process. Cashier's check for the full amount. Arrive early to inspect the property. Be prepared to own it immediately upon winning the bid. No financing, no inspections, no backing out. One more thing, she added, as I prepared to leave. Make sure you're doing this for the right reasons. Family and real estate make complicated bedfellows. You might win the house and lose the relationships. I looked out her office window at the Scottsdale landscape, all red rock and endless sky. I think I lost those relationships a long time ago, I said. I'm just tired of pretending otherwise. Thursday passed in a blur of preparation. I arranged for the cashier's check, reviewed comparable property sales in the neighborhood, and tried to focus on regular work tasks despite the anticipation building in my chest. I didn't call my parents. I didn't drive by the house. I waited. Friday morning arrived with the kind of blazing Arizona sunrise that painted the mountains pink and gold. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue business suit that made me look professional and competent. I wanted to project success, not desperation. The courthouse steps were crowded with investors, real estate agents, and a few nervous-looking homeowners hoping for last-minute salvation. I spotted Margaret in the crowd and made my way over to her. "Ready for this?" she asked. I patted my purse, where the cashier's check sat in a secure envelope. "As ready as I'll ever be." The auctioneer was a thin man with a clipboard and a voice that carried across the plaza. He read through the legal description of each property, called for opening bids, and moved through the process with businesslike efficiency. When he reached 847 Desert Rose Drive, my childhood address, I felt my pulse quicken. A few investors raised their paddles for the opening bid. The price climbed slowly. $87,000, $90,000, $95,000. At $105,000, most of the bidders dropped out. At $115,000, it was down to me and one other investor, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he flipped houses for a living. $120,000, I called out clearly. The other bidder hesitated, then shook his head. The auctioneer looked around for additional bids, found none, and brought down his gavel. Sold to bidder number 47 for $120,000. Just like that, I owned my childhood home. The paperwork took another hour. I signed documents, handed over the cashier's check, and received the deed to a house my parents didn't know they'd lost. Margaret shook my hand on the courthouse steps. "Congratulations," she said. "You're now a landlord. What happens next is up to you." I drove home in a daze, the deed sitting on my passenger seat like evidence of a crime I wasn't sure I'd committed. My phone had 3 missed calls from Mom, probably checking to see if I planned to help Kevin's family settle in over the weekend. I didn't call her back. Instead, I sat in my apartment, holding the deed to 847 Desert Rose Drive, and realized that for the first time in my adult life, I held all the power in my relationship with my parents. The question now was what I was going to do with it. Saturday morning arrived with the sound of moving trucks rumbling down Desert Rose Drive. I watched from my apartment balcony as Kevin's burgundy pickup truck pulled into my parents' driveway, followed by a yellow U-Haul that looked like it had seen better decades. The irony of the situation settled over me like morning fog. They were moving into a house I now owned, completely unaware that their gracious hosts were 3 days away from discovering they no longer held the deed to their own property. I had spent Friday night after the auction in a strange state of suspended animation. Part of me wanted to call my parents immediately, to reveal what I'd done and watch their world shift in real time. But another part, the part that had been dismissed and overlooked for 28 years, wanted to savor this moment of invisible power. For once, I knew something they didn't. For once, I held cards they couldn't see. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Kevin's family is here. Everything's going smoothly. Thanks for being understanding about the room situation." I stared at the message, marveling at the casual tone. No acknowledgement of how this might feel for me. No recognition that giving away someone's childhood space without consultation might be hurtful. Just gratitude for my compliance, as if I were a child who'd finally learned to behave properly. I drove to Scottsdale around noon, telling myself, I was just checking on a property investment. The U-Haul was still parked in the driveway, and I could hear children's voices carrying across the desert landscaping. Kevin's 3 kids, ages 5, 8, and 10, were running circles around the front yard while the adults carried boxes and furniture. I parked across the street and watched the scene unfold. Kevin looked older than his 30 years, his brown hair thinning at the crown, his face carrying the worn expression of someone who'd been knocked down too many times. Lisa, his wife, was a tiny woman with nervous energy, constantly checking on the children while trying to help with the move. My parents moved among the chaos with the kind of forced cheerfulness that accompanies difficult decisions. Mom directed traffic flow with her characteristic need to control every detail, while Dad hefted boxes with the determined strength of a man trying to prove he was still useful. What struck me most was how seamlessly they'd all adapted to this new arrangement. Kevin's family settling into my space, my parents accommodating their needs, everyone moving forward as if Jessica Torres had never existed in this equation. It was like watching a play where my character had been written out between acts, and the story continued without missing a beat. I was about to drive away when I saw something that made my stomach clench. Kevin's oldest son, Tommy, was carrying a box labeled Jessica's room in Mom's careful handwriting. Behind him, Lisa carried another box with the same label. They were packing up my belongings, the remnants of my childhood, treating them like obstacles to be cleared rather than memories to be preserved. The anger that rose in my throat was different from what I'd felt on Tuesday. This wasn't the cold fury of calculated revenge. This was raw hurt, the kind that came from watching your own family treat your history like garage sale items. I called Margaret Henley from my car. "Jessica, how are you feeling about yesterday's purchase?" "I need to know my rights as the new owner," I said, watching Kevin's family continue their cheerful destruction of my past. Specifically, my rights regarding existing occupants and their guests. Margaret's voice grew more cautious. "What exactly are you thinking?" They're packing up my personal belongings without my permission, treating my childhood room like it's community property. I want to know if I can legally require them to stop. Well, technically, you're now the homeowner. Your parents are legally tenants, though they don't know it yet. Any guests they have are there at your discretion as the property owner. But Jessica, I'd strongly advise against— I'm not planning anything dramatic, I interrupted. I just want to understand my position. After hanging up, I sat in my car for another hour, watching my family reorganize their lives around my absence. The children played in what used to be my backyard. Kevin and Dad shared a beer on what used to be my front porch. Mom hung laundry on the line where she'd once hung my school clothes to dry in the desert sun. They looked happy, settled, like they'd solved a problem by erasing me from the equation. That evening, I met Brianna at our favorite wine bar in downtown Phoenix. She took one look at my face and ordered a bottle of the good stuff. "Okay, spill," she said, settling into the booth across from me. What fresh hell has the Torres family unleashed now? I told her everything. The phone call about my room, the discovery of the foreclosure, the auction, the deed that was now sitting in my safe at home. Brianna listened without interruption, her expressions cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that looked like admiration. "So, you bought your parents' house," she said finally, without telling them. "I bought a house at a legal foreclosure auction," I corrected. "The fact that my parents happen to live there is coincidental." "Jessica." Brianna leaned forward, her dark eyes serious. "You know that's not true. This wasn't about real estate investment. This was about power." She was right, of course. Brianna had always been able to see through my rationalizations. During college, she'd been the one to point out that my academic overachievement was less about loving school and more about proving my worth to parents who'd never asked for proof. She'd been the one to suggest that maybe my workaholism wasn't just ambition, but a way of building walls between myself and the people who'd hurt me. "So what if it was about power?" I said, taking a long sip of wine. "Is that so wrong? They've had all the power in this relationship for 28 years. They've made decisions about my life, my space, my belongings, without consulting me. Maybe it's time they experienced what that feels like." "And then what? You reveal that you're their new landlord? You evict Kevin's family? You make your parents grovel for forgiveness? What's the end game here?" I didn't have an answer for that. I'd been so focused on the chess move of buying the house that I hadn't thought through the entire game. All I knew was that for the first time in my relationship with my family, I wasn't the one scrambling to accommodate everyone else's needs. "Maybe there doesn't need to be an endgame," I said. "Maybe it's enough that I'm not powerless anymore." Brianna nodded slowly. "I get it. I really do. But just remember that power without purpose tends to corrupt. And you're not a corrupt person, Jess. You're hurt. There's a difference." We finished the bottle and talked about other things, but her words stayed with me as I drove home through the glittering Phoenix night. Was I becoming someone I didn't recognize? Was this calculated silence a form of strength? Or was it just sophisticated cruelty? Sunday morning brought another text from Mom. "Kevin's family is settling in so well. The kids love the pool. We should all have dinner together soon." The casual invitation felt like salt in an open wound. Now that I'd been successfully erased from the living space, they wanted to include me in social activities. Now that my room had been redistributed, they were ready to play happy family. I spent the day researching landlord-tenant law in Arizona, trying to understand exactly what I'd gotten myself into. The legal reality was complex but clear. My parents had rights as existing occupants, but those rights were limited. I could require them to sign a formal lease. I could set rent amounts. I could establish rules about guests and property modifications. More importantly, I could require them to acknowledge me as the property owner. Every month, they would have to write a check with my name on it. Every repair request would come to me. Every decision about their living space would ultimately be mine to approve or deny. The power dynamic had completely reversed, and they didn't even know it yet. Monday brought an unexpected complication. I was reviewing client presentations in my office when my assistant knocked on my door. "There's a Robert Torres here to see you," she said. "He says he's your father." My blood turned to ice water. Dad never came to my office. In 8 years of working in Phoenix, he'd never once visited my workplace. The fact that he was here, now, 3 days after I'd bought his house, felt like too much of a coincidence. "Send him in," I said, quickly closing the property records I'd been reviewing on my computer. Dad walked into my office looking older. Then I remembered, his shoulders carrying a weight that hadn't been there during my childhood. His hair was more gray than brown now, and his face had the kind of deep lines that came from years of worry rather than laughter. "Nice office," he said, looking around at the modern furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows. "Very impressive." "Thanks. What brings you downtown?" He sat heavily in the chair across from my desk, and I noticed his hands shaking slightly as he placed them on his knees. "I wanted to talk to you about something, and I didn't want to do it over the phone." My heart hammered against my ribs. Had he somehow found out about the auction? Had a neighbor seen me at the courthouse? Had the deed filing triggered some kind of notification I wasn't aware of? "Jessica, your mother and I are in some financial trouble." The relief I felt was immediately replaced by a different kind of tension. He was going to tell me about the foreclosure. He was going to ask for help. The conversation I'd been imagining for days was about to happen, but not in the way I'd expected. "What kind of trouble?" I asked carefully. Dad's hands clenched and unclenched in his lap. "We're behind on the mortgage. Have been for a few months now. The bank sent some notices, but we kept thinking we could catch up. Your mother's been picking up extra shifts at the hospital, and I've been doing some consulting work, but it's not enough." I waited, letting him continue. "The thing is, we got a notice last week that the house is going to be auctioned off. If we don't bring the payments current, we owe about $87,000. "That's a lot of money," I said, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "It is. And we've been going back and forth about whether to ask you for help. Your mother thinks we should handle it ourselves, but I know you've done well for yourself. And I thought maybe." He trailed off, looking out my office window at the Phoenix skyline. In the silence, I could hear the faint hum of traffic, 20 floors below, the distant sound of a city full of people making difficult decisions. "You thought maybe I could lend you the money," I finished for him. "Not lend. I know we probably couldn't pay you back anytime soon, but maybe you could help us figure out a solution. You understand finance better than we do." The irony was so thick I could taste it. Here was my father, asking for my help with a problem I'd already solved without his knowledge. He was finally acknowledging my expertise, my success, my ability to contribute to family solutions. But it was 3 days. Too late. "When is the auction?" I asked. "Friday. This Friday." His voice cracked slightly. "We've been trying to figure out how to tell Kevin and Lisa. They just got settled, and the kids are so excited about having their own rooms for the summer." I studied his face, looking for signs of the man who'd once explained saguaro cactus, survival strategies to an 8-year-old girl. He was still there, underneath the worry and the shame, but he looked so much smaller than I remembered. "Dad, why didn't you tell me about this earlier? Why wait until the last possible moment?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Because I was embarrassed. Because I've spent your whole life trying to be the kind of father who had everything under control, and admitting that I'd failed this badly felt like admitting that I'd failed at everything." "You didn't fail at everything, didn't I?" He looked up at me and I saw tears in his eyes. I failed to provide for my family. I failed to plan for the future. I failed to ask for help when I needed it. And I failed to make you feel like you were important enough to include in family decisions. The last part hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean? The room, Jessica. Your mother told me about the phone call, about how upset you were. She said you were being dramatic. But I know better. I know we hurt you. I know we've been hurting you for years, making you feel like your needs don't matter as much as everyone else's. I felt tears pricking at my eyes and blinked them back hard. This was not how I'd imagined this conversation going. I'd expected defensiveness, justification, maybe anger. I hadn't expected vulnerability or acknowledgement. It did hurt, I admitted. It felt like you were erasing me. We were, not intentionally, but that's what we were doing, and now we're about to lose the house anyway, and Kevin's family will have to move out, and you'll never get your room back, and I'll have destroyed everything trying to avoid asking for help. I sat there looking at my father, this man who'd taught me to be strong and independent, now asking me to save him from the consequences of his own pride. The deed to his house was sitting in my apartment safe, giving me the power to solve his problems or destroy his world. The auction is Friday morning, I said finally. At the courthouse. Yes, 10 o'clock. And you need $87,000 to stop it, plus fees and penalties, probably closer to $90,000. I pretended to consider this information, though I'd memorized every detail days ago. That's a significant amount of money, Dad. I know. I know it's a lot to ask, but Jessica, you're the only person in our family who has that kind of success. You're the only one who might be able to help. The only one. After years of being treated as optional, I was suddenly essential. After years of my achievements being downplayed or ignored, my financial success was finally being acknowledged. The validation felt good and terrible at the same time. I need to think about it, I said. This is a big decision. Dad nodded, standing up from his chair. Of course, I understand. I probably shouldn't have sprung this on you at work. It's okay. I'm glad you told me. He paused, at my office door. Jessica, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I know I don't say it enough, but look at this. He gestured around my office. Look at what you've built. You're stronger than your old man ever was. After he left, I sat in my office staring at the closed door. My father, who'd never visited my workplace before, had come to ask for my help. My father, who'd spent decades treating my opinions as less important than everyone else's, had finally acknowledged my competence. My father, who'd hurt me in ways he was only beginning to understand, had apologized. And I held the power to save him or let him fall. The temptation to tell him the truth was overwhelming, to reveal that I'd already solved his problem, that I'd taken control of the situation he felt so helpless in. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of Tuesday's phone call, the casual way Mom had dismissed my feelings. Maybe it was the sight of my belongings being packed up like garage sale items. Maybe it was 28 years of being made to feel like my needs were negotiable. Or maybe it was the knowledge that if I revealed what I'd done now, the conversation would shift to my deception rather than their treatment of me. They would become the victims of my secrecy rather than the architects of their own financial crisis. I picked up my phone and texted him. Let me look at my finances tonight. I'll call you tomorrow. His response came immediately. Thank you, sweetheart. This means everything. I stared at the word sweetheart, a term of endearment he hadn't used since I was a child. It was amazing how quickly gratitude could restore affection, how desperation could make people remember love they'd been taking for granted. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and the deed to 847 Desert Rose Drive spread out on my dining room table. The legal language was dry and official, but the reality it represented was profound. I owned my childhood home. I owned my parents' security. I owned the power to determine their future. The question was what kind of person I wanted to be with that power. Outside my windows, Phoenix glittered in the desert night. A city built by people who'd refused to accept the limitations of their environment. I'd spent 8 years building my own version of that same stubborn persistence, creating a life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or support. But owning my parents' house wasn't about independence anymore. It was about interdependence, about the complicated web of family obligations and resentments that no amount of financial success could untangle. I thought about Dad's visit, about the shame in his voice when he'd admitted to failing. I thought about Mom's text messages, about her casual dismissal of my feelings followed by cheerful updates about Kevin's family. I thought about 28, years of being made to feel like an afterthought in my own family's story. And I thought about the choice I had to make. Reveal my hand now, or let Friday's discovery teach them what it felt like to have their world changed without their consent. I folded the deed carefully and put it back in my safe. Tomorrow I would call Dad back. But tonight, I would let them continue living in the illusion that their fate was still in someone else's hands. After all, they'd taught me that some lessons were too important to explain. Sometimes, people had to learn them the hard way. Tuesday morning arrived with the weight of unfinished conversations. I had promised Dad I would call him with an answer about the loan, and my phone had been buzzing with increasingly anxious messages since sunrise. Each text felt more desperate than the last, a countdown to Friday's auction that only I knew had already concluded. Any thoughts on our discussion yesterday? Followed by, I know it's a lot to process. And finally, your Mom doesn't know I asked. Please don't mention it to her yet. The last message made me pause. So Mom didn't know Dad had swallowed his pride and come to me for help. She was still operating under the assumption that they would handle this crisis themselves, the same way they'd handled every family decision for the past decade without consulting me. The irony was rich enough to choke on. I spent the morning in client meetings, discussing brand positioning and market penetration strategies while my phone continued its steady vibration of family anxiety. During lunch, I finally called Dad. Back. Jessica, thank God, he answered on the first ring. I've been going crazy waiting to hear from you. I've been thinking about our conversation, I said, settling into my car in the parking garage beneath my office building. It's complicated. I know it is. I know it's a huge amount of money. But we're really desperate here, sweetheart. I've tried everything else. The desperation in his voice was real, and it tugged at something deep in my chest. This was my father, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped with calculus homework, and told me I could be anything I wanted to be. But he was also the man who'd spent years treating my needs as optional, who'd allowed Mom to dismiss my feelings, who'd stood by while my space and belongings were redistributed without my consent. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Of course. If I help you with this, if I save the house, what guarantee do I have that things will change? That I'll actually be treated like a valued member of this family instead of a convenient solution to problems? The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough around the edges. You're right to ask that. You're right to want guarantees. We haven't given you any reason to trust that we'll do better. No, you haven't. Jessica, I can't promise that your mother will suddenly become a different person. I can't promise that we won't make mistakes or hurt your feelings again. But I can promise that I'm finally seeing how we've treated you. And I want to do better. This crisis has made me realize what's actually important. I closed my eyes, listening to the echo of his words in the parking garage. What's actually important? Family. Real family. Not the performative kind where everyone pretends to be happy while ignoring the problems. The kind where people show up for each other, even when it's uncomfortable. It was a beautiful sentiment. And maybe he even meant it. But I'd heard variations of this speech before, usually during holiday gatherings when too much wine made everyone temporarily sentimental about family bonds. The difference was that this time, he needed something. From me. This time, his awareness of our family dysfunction coincided perfectly with his desperation for my financial help. I appreciate that, Dad, but I need some time to think about the logistics. $90,000 isn't pocket change, even for me. Of course. How much time do you need? I looked at my watch. It was Tuesday afternoon. The auction had been Friday morning. In the normal timeline, they had 3 days to come up with a solution. In the actual timeline, the solution had already been implemented without their knowledge. Give me until Thursday, I said. I'll have an answer for you then. Thursday. Okay. That still gives us time to figure out alternatives if you can't help. The alternatives. I wondered what he imagined those might be. A last-minute loan from Uncle Carlos, who was barely managing his own finances. A successful appeal to the mortgage company for another modification? A miracle? After we hung up, I sat in my car thinking about the conversation. Dad's acknowledgement of their treatment felt genuine, but it was also perfectly timed to maximize my sympathy. Was this real personal growth, or was it strategic vulnerability designed to secure my financial assistance? The answer probably didn't matter. People were complex, and motivations were rarely pure. What mattered was that for the first time in our relationship, he was acknowledging my value beyond my utility, even if that acknowledgement came wrapped in a request for help. That afternoon, I found myself driving past the house again, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't quite name. Kevin's U-Haul was gone, but the driveway was full of cars. Mom's sedan, Dad's pickup truck, Uncle Carlos's ancient Buick, and a red Honda I didn't recognize. A family meeting was apparently in progress. I parked down the street and watched through my sunglasses as animated figures moved past the living room windows. Someone was gesticulating wildly, probably Mom, and the body language visible through the glass suggested heated discussion rather than casual conversation. My phone buzzed with a call from an unknown local number. Is this Jessica Torres? The voice was unfamiliar, professionally polite. Yes? This is Sandra Chen from First National Title Company. We processed a property transaction for you last Friday, and we have some documents that need your signature. When would be convenient for you to come in? My stomach dropped. I'd forgotten about the post-auction paperwork, the administrative details that followed property purchases. What kind of documents? Standard landlord notification requirements. Since the property has existing occupants, Arizona law requires certain disclosures and notifications. Nothing complicated, but it needs to be handled within 7 business days of the sale. 7 business days. That meant I had until next Friday to complete the legal requirements that would officially notify my parents of their change in housing status. The irony was almost too perfect. I had exactly 1 week to decide whether to let them discover their situation organically or to control the revelation myself. Can I come in Thursday afternoon? I asked. Absolutely. Say 3 o'clock? After confirming the appointment, I continued watching the house. The family meeting seemed to be intensifying, with more gesturing and what looked like Uncle Carlos pacing back and forth. I wondered if Dad had finally told them about the foreclosure, if they were all pooling resources and brainstorming solutions. My phone rang again, this time showing Mom's contact photo. Jessica, where are you right now? The question caught me off guard. At work. Why? Could you come by the house? We're having a family discussion, and we could use your input. I looked through my windshield at the house where I was currently parked, watching their family discussion unfold. What kind of discussion? It's about finances, about some challenges we're facing. Your father thought you might have some professional insights that could help. So Dad had told them, The family meeting wasn't about Kevin's job search or summer vacation planning. It was about the foreclosure, about their desperate need for solutions, about the expertise I possessed that they'd spent years dismissing as irrelevant to family matters. "I'm pretty busy this afternoon," I said, which was technically true since I was busy watching them through my car window. "Could we do this tonight? Or maybe Thursday?" "Jessica, this is important. We really need your help." "We really need your help." 4 words that encapsulated everything wrong with our family dynamic. Not, "we value your opinion," or "we'd appreciate your perspective." We need your help. I was being summoned because I was useful, not because I was loved. "Let me see what I can rearrange," I said. "Give me an hour." "Thank you, sweetheart. This means so much." I drove away from Desert Rose Drive feeling like I was playing a complex game of chess where I was the only player who could see the entire board. They were strategizing about a problem I'd already solved, seeking help from someone who already held all the power, having urgent family meetings about a crisis that existed only in their perception of reality. The temptation to walk into that house and reveal everything was almost overwhelming. To see their faces when I announced that their foreclosure crisis was over because I'd purchased the property myself. To watch Mom's expression when she realized that her daughter, the one she'd been treating as an afterthought, now controlled their housing security. But something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of Dad's vulnerability in my office, his genuine acknowledgement of their failures. Maybe it was the knowledge that revealing my secret now would shift the focus from their behavior to my deception. Or maybe it was simply the desire to let them experience uncertainty for a while longer, to feel what it was like when important decisions were made without their input. I spent the next hour at a coffee shop near my office, watching the afternoon crowd, and trying to decide what version of myself I wanted to be when I walked into that family meeting. The daughter who swooped in to save them? The business professional who analyzed their situation objectively? The hurt child who finally had leverage to demand better treatment? At 5 o'clock, I drove back to Scottsdale and parked in the driveway I now legally owned. The cars were still there, and I could hear voices through the front door as I approached. The sound of my childhood home filled with family anxiety was both familiar and strange. Mom opened the door before I could knock, her face tight with stress. "Oh, thank goodness you're here. Come in, come in." The living room looked like a war room. Papers were spread across the coffee table, laptops open, calculators scattered among coffee cups and tissue boxes. Uncle Carlos sat in Dad's recliner, looking older than his 65 years. Kevin and Lisa occupied the couch, their faces carrying the particular strain of people who'd just discovered their housing situation was more complicated than they'd thought. Dad stood when I entered, his relief visible. "Jessica, thank you for coming." "Of course, what's going on?" Mom gestured toward the chaos of documents. "We're trying to figure out our options. Your father finally told us about the mortgage situation." I looked around the room, taking in their faces. Uncle Carlos appeared embarrassed, probably remembering the $15,000 he'd borrowed from my college fund. Kevin looked confused and worried, likely realizing that his summer housing arrangement was more precarious than he'd understood. Lisa kept glancing toward the hallway where I could hear children's voices, probably calculating how quickly they could pack up and move out if necessary. "It's pretty serious," I said, settling into the chair across from the couch. "Foreclosure is nothing to mess around with." "We know," Mom said sharply. "That's why we need to find a solution quickly." "What solutions have you considered?" Dad pulled out a legal pad covered with his careful handwriting. "We've been through everything. Another loan modification, but the bank says we don't qualify. A reverse mortgage, but we're too young. Selling the house, but there's not enough time to find a buyer and close before Friday." "What about family?" I asked, curious to see if anyone would mention the obvious source of help sitting right in front of them. Uncle Carlos shifted uncomfortably. I wish I could help, but my own situation isn't great right now. The restaurant business has been tough since the pandemic. Kevin spoke up for the first time. Lisa and I have some savings, but not nearly enough, maybe $5,000. And we'd need that for moving expenses if we have to find another place. Everyone looked at Mom, whose jaw was set in that familiar, stubborn line. We've always handled our own problems. I don't want to burden anyone else with our mistakes. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. Here was my mother, surrounded by family members trying to help, still insisting on independence while simultaneously hosting a family meeting to solve their financial crisis. Here she was, claiming not to want to burden anyone, while her house was full of relatives whose lives would be disrupted if she lost the property. Sometimes accepting help isn't about burdening people, I said carefully. Sometimes it's about letting people who care about you contribute to solutions. Mom's eyes flashed. Easy for you to say. You've never had to depend on anyone for anything. The comment hit like a slap. Never had to depend on anyone? I'd built my independence, specifically because depending on this family had proven so unreliable. I'd learned to solve my own problems because asking for their help usually resulted in disappointment or conditions that came with emotional costs I couldn't afford. You're right, I said, surprised by my own calm tone. I haven't had to depend on anyone. I've been fortunate in that way. Dad cleared his throat. Jessica, you mentioned you needed to think about logistics. Have you had a chance to consider whether you might be able to help us? The room went very quiet. Uncle Carlos stopped fidgeting. Kevin and Lisa exchanged glances. Mom's face went through a series of expressions, settling somewhere between hope and resentment. You asked Jessica for money? Mom's voice was sharp with disbelief. I asked Jessica for advice, Dad corrected. And yes, I also asked if she might be able to help financially. She's the most successful person in this room, and this is her family. Why wouldn't I ask? Because it's not her responsibility to fix our problems. And it's not her fault that we have problems, Dad shot back. But it might be her choice to help solve them. I watched this exchange with fascination. My parents, who'd spent years presenting a united front in family decisions, were now arguing about whether to accept help from the daughter they'd been systematically excluding from those same decisions. What kind of help are we talking about? Uncle Carlos asked quietly. Dad looked at me, clearly hoping I'd take the lead. When I didn't immediately respond, he continued. The total amount needed to stop the foreclosure is about $90,000. Jessica has built a successful career, and I thought maybe she could loan us the money, or part of it. $90,000, Kevin repeated, his voice hollow. Jesus, that's a lot of money. It's a lot to ask, Lisa added, looking at me with something between sympathy and calculation. Mom stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. We are not asking Jessica to mortgage her future for our mistakes. What future are you worried about? I asked. My financial future? My relationship with this family? My emotional well-being? All of it. Mom's voice was rising. You've worked hard to build your life. You shouldn't have to sacrifice your security for ours. It was a noble sentiment, and it might even have been genuine. But it was also perfectly timed to preserve her pride while appearing selfless. If I offered help, she could accept it graciously while maintaining the moral high ground. If I declined, she could claim she'd never wanted to ask in the first place. What if I wanted to help? I asked. What if I considered this family worth investing in? The question hung in the air like smoke. Uncle Carlos was studying his hands. Kevin and Lisa were looking at each other with expressions I couldn't read. Dad was watching me with hope and fear in equal measure. Mom sat back down, her voice quieter now. Then I guess we'd have to figure out how to accept help gracefully, even though we've never been very good at that. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from her, and it caught me off guard. Not a direct acknowledgement of how they'd treated me, but an admission that they'd been poor at accepting support. It was a crack in the wall, small but significant. "I've been thinking about this since yesterday," I said, which was true in the most technical sense. "And I think there might be a way to help that works for everyone." The room seemed to hold its breath. Dad leaned forward. Mom gripped the arm of her chair. Even the children's voices from the back of the house seemed to quiet, as if the entire house was waiting for my next words. "But I need to be completely honest with all of you about something first." "What do you mean?" Dad's voice was cautious. I looked around the room at these people who'd shaped my entire life, who'd taught me both love and disappointment in equal measure, who were now sitting in a house I legally owned while begging me to save them from losing it. "I mean that this conversation is more complicated than you realize. And before we go any further, there are some things you need to know about your situation that you haven't figured out yet." Mom's face went pale. "What kind of things?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder I'd prepared that morning, containing copies of the foreclosure documents, the auction listing, and the deed transfer. My hands were steady as I placed it on the coffee table among their scattered papers and desperate calculations. "Things about what happened at the courthouse on Friday morning," I said. "Things about who actually owns this house now." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the air conditioning cycling on in the background, the distant sound of children playing in what used to be my bedroom, the tick of the grandfather clock that had marked time in this house for 30 years. Dad reached for the folder with shaking hands. "Jessica, what is this?" "Open it and find out." He opened the folder and stared at the first document for a long moment. His face went through a series of changes, confusion giving way to understanding, understanding giving way to shock. "You bought our house," he said, his voice barely audible. "I bought a house at a legal foreclosure auction," I corrected, "the same way any investor would." Mom grabbed the folder from Dad's hands, scanning the documents frantically. "This can't be right. This says the sale was on Friday. You didn't even know about the foreclosure until yesterday." "Actually, I found out about it last week. Public records are available to anyone who knows where to look." Kevin was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "You've known about this for a week? While we were moving in, while Dad was panicking, while we were all trying to figure out solutions?" "I've known about it since before you moved in," I said. "I've known about it since before Dad came to my office asking for help. I've known about it since before this family meeting was called to discuss options that don't actually exist anymore." Uncle Carlos found his voice first. "So what does this mean? What happens now?" I looked around the room at their faces, reading fear and confusion and the beginning of anger. These were my parents, my uncle, my cousin and his family. These were the people who'd raised me and disappointed me and shaped who I'd become. And now they were looking at me like I was a stranger who'd infiltrated their crisis with ulterior motives. "What happens now," I said, "is that we have an honest conversation about how this family works, about respect and communication, and what it means to actually include someone in decisions that affect them." "You could have told us," Mom said, her voice shaking. "You could have told us you'd bought the house instead of letting us sit here begging you for help. The same way you told me you were giving my room away, the same way you told me you were facing foreclosure, the same way you've told me about any major family decision over the past 10 years. The accusations hung in the air like grenades with pulled pins. Everyone was looking at everyone else, and no one seemed to know what to say next. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. "So what are your terms?" "My terms? You own our house now. We're your tenants, whether we knew it or not. What are your terms? For letting us stay?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding thinking about directly. What did I want from this situation? Revenge? Acknowledgement? A genuine change in how this family operated? An apology for 28 years of being treated as optional? "My terms," I said slowly, are that we start treating each other like adults who deserve honesty and respect. My terms are that family decisions get discussed with all affected family members before they're implemented. My terms are that we stop pretending dysfunction is normal just because it's familiar. Mom was crying now, quiet tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. We never meant to hurt you. But you did hurt me, repeatedly. And when I tried to tell you how it felt, you dismissed my feelings as being too sensitive or dramatic. You're right, Dad said. We did do that, and now you're in a position to hurt us back. I looked at him, this man who'd taught me to be strong, and then acted surprised when I'd grown strong enough to challenge him. I don't want to hurt you back. I want us to do better. Even after everything? Mom asked. Even after we've been so unfair to you? Especially after everything, because this is what families are supposed to do. They're supposed to support each other, not compete with each other. They're supposed to communicate, not manipulate. They're supposed to make space for everyone, not just the people who are easiest to accommodate. Kevin spoke up hesitantly. What about us? Lisa and the kids and me? Do we need to move out? I looked at him. This cousin who'd always been treated as more important than me, who'd benefited from family resources I'd been told weren't available, who was now sitting in my childhood bedroom with his children while asking if I was going to evict them. That depends, I said. Are you planning to stay all summer? We were, but if it's going to cause problems... It's not going to cause problems, but it is going to be different, because this isn't Mom and Dad's house anymore. It's mine. And in my house, people communicate before making decisions that affect other people. The room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the desperate silence of people trying to solve an impossible problem, but the thoughtful silence of people trying to understand new rules for old relationships. So what happens next? Uncle Carlos asked. I stood up, gathering the documents and putting them back in the folder. What happens next is that we figure out how to be a family that actually functions. What happens next is that you all decide whether you want to live in a house owned by someone you've spent years treating as optional. What happens next is up to all of us. I walked toward the door, then turned back to look at them one more time. I'll be back Thursday evening for dinner. We can talk more then about what our new arrangement looks like. But I want everyone to think honestly about whether they're ready to treat me like I matter, not just when you need something from me, but all the time. As I drove away from Desert Rose Drive, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of 5 adults standing on the porch I now owned, watching me leave the house that was now mine, probably wondering how the balance of power in the Torres family had shifted so completely while they weren't paying attention. The answer, of course, was that it had shifted gradually over years of small dismissals and casual cruelties, accumulating like sediment until it formed the foundation for exactly this moment. I hadn't stolen their house. I'd simply been the only one paying attention when it became available. Wednesday morning brought chaos disguised as silence. My phone stayed mercifully quiet until 9 a.m., but I could feel the storm brewing across the desert distance that separated my downtown Phoenix apartment from the Scottsdale house, where 5 adults were probably sitting around the kitchen table, trying to process the bomb I'd detonated in their living room the night before. When the calls finally started, they came in waves. First Dad, his voice careful and measured like he was negotiating a hostage situation. Then Uncle Carlos, awkward and apologetic. Then Kevin, confused and slightly angry. Mom didn't call at all, which somehow felt more ominous than if she'd screamed at me for an hour. I let them all go to voicemail and drove to work through the morning heat, Phoenix stretching endlessly in every direction like a testament to human stubbornness. The city had been built in a place where cities weren't supposed to exist, carved out of desert through sheer force of will and air conditioning. It seemed like an appropriate backdrop for what I was trying to do with my family. My assistant, Rachel, knocked on my office door around 10:30 with a concerned expression. "There's a Patricia Torres downstairs in the lobby. She says she's your mother and needs to speak with you urgently. Security wants to know if you're available. My stomach clenched. Mom had never come to my office, not once in 8 years. The fact that she was here now, less than 18 hours after discovering I owned her house, felt like a declaration of war wrapped in a maternal visit. "Send her up," I said, quickly closing the property management websites I'd been browsing. 5 minutes later, Mom walked into my office looking like she'd aged 5 years overnight. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt instead of her typical polished appearance. The lack of armor was almost more unsettling than anger would have been. "Nice view," she said, looking out at the Phoenix skyline instead of at me. "Thanks. I didn't expect to see you here." She sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk, the same chair Dad had occupied just 2 days earlier when he'd asked for my help with a crisis I'd already solved. The symmetry wasn't lost on either of us. "I couldn't sleep last night," she said. "Kept thinking about what you said, about how we've treated you, about what it must have felt like to watch us scramble for solutions to a problem you'd already handled." I waited, sensing there was more coming. "I also kept thinking about how smart you had to be to figure out the foreclosure situation before we even told you about it. How you managed to research everything, attend the auction, handle all the legal paperwork, and none of us had any idea." She finally looked at me. "That takes a special kind of competence and a special kind of anger." "Are you here to lecture me about deception?" "No." Her voice was quiet. "I'm here to ask you what you want from us now." It was such a direct question that it caught me off guard. I'd expected accusations, justifications, maybe threats about family loyalty. I hadn't expected vulnerability. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you hold all the cards now, Jessica. You own our house. You control our living situation. You have the power to make our lives comfortable or miserable. And frankly, we've given you plenty of reasons to choose miserable." She paused, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. "So I'm asking what you want. Revenge? An apology? For us to grovel? What's your endgame here?" I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or strategy. Patricia Torres was a master of emotional chess, capable of turning any conversation to her advantage through carefully deployed guilt or charm. But she looked genuinely defeated, like someone who'd finally run out of moves. "I want us to be a real family," I said. "Not the kind that performs happiness at holidays while ignoring problems the rest of the year. The kind that actually supports each other." "And if we can't do that? If we're too old and too set in our ways to change?" The question hung between us like a challenge. "Then I guess you'll have to decide if you'd rather learn new ways of relating to each other or find somewhere else to live." Mom flinched as if I'd slapped her. "You'd really evict us? Your own parents?" "I'd really stop enabling dysfunction that hurts everyone involved, including you and Dad. By throwing us out of our home? By requiring you to acknowledge that it's not your home anymore. That your housing security now depends on maintaining a respectful relationship with someone you've spent years dismissing." I leaned forward. "Mom, you gave away my childhood bedroom without asking me. You've excluded me from family decisions for a decade. You've treated my achievements like they were somehow threatening to family harmony. Did you think there would never be consequences for that?" She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "We were threatened by your success." "What?" "Your father and we were intimidated by how well you'd done for yourself. College degree, fancy job, nice apartment, financial independence. It made us feel like failures as parents, like we hadn't been able to provide the kind of life you'd built for yourself." I felt something shift in my chest, surprise mixing with old hurt. "So you dealt with feeling inadequate by making me feel unwelcome?" "We dealt with feeling inadequate by pretending your success didn't matter as much as family loyalty, by treating your independence like it was selfishness, by convincing ourselves that Kevin and Lisa needed help more than you needed inclusion. It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me, and it explained so much about our family dynamics. They hadn't been dismissing my achievements out of cruelty, but out of their own insecurity. They'd been protecting their egos by diminishing my accomplishments, making themselves feel better by making me feel smaller. That's a reason, Mom, but it's not an excuse. I know. Tears were running down her face now. I know it's not an excuse. I know we damaged our relationship with you, and I know you had every right to buy that house and let us discover it the hard way. But I'm hoping you'll give us a chance to do better. I'm hoping this family is worth saving. I looked at my mother, this woman who'd raised me and hurt me and shaped me in ways I was still discovering. She looked fragile sitting in my office chair, asking for mercy from the daughter she'd spent years treating as optional. What would doing better look like? I asked. I don't know yet. I've never had to figure out how to treat you like an equal before. She wiped her eyes with a tissue from my desk. But I'm willing to learn if you're willing to teach me. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was acknowledgement, which was more than I'd gotten in 28 years of family membership. It was also terrifying, because it meant I had to decide whether I believed people could actually change, or whether I was setting myself up for more disappointment. There are going to have to be rules, I said. What kind of rules? I pulled out a legal pad and started writing, my business brain taking over. First, no more major family decisions without consulting everyone affected. That includes room, assignments, vacation planning, financial decisions that impact the household. She nodded. Second, Kevin and Lisa can stay for the summer, but they pay rent. Not to you and Dad, to me. Market rate for their room and board. They don't have much money. Then they can contribute in other ways. Household maintenance, childcare, whatever. But the days of family members getting free rides while I get treated like an outsider are over. Mom winced but nodded again. Third, my belongings get moved back into my room. All of them. Kevin's kids can use the guest room or sleep in the living room, but my space gets restored. What about when you visit? Do you want us to kick them out every time? When I visit, I want to be treated like family returning home, not like a guest who needs accommodation. Figure out how to make that work. I kept writing, surprised by how clearly the boundaries came to me once I started articulating them. Years of therapy and business negotiation had taught me to identify my needs and communicate them directly, skills I'd never applied to family relationships before. Fourth, family gatherings include me from the planning stage. No more surprise. Announcements about events I'm expected to accommodate. Done. Fifth, we have family meetings once a month. Real ones, where we talk about how things are going and address problems before they become crises. Like a board meeting for the Torres family? Exactly like that. Mom almost smiled. You really have thought this through. I've had years to think about what was wrong with how we operated. I just never had the leverage to insist on changes before. She was quiet for a moment, reading through the list. I'd written, "These seem reasonable, probably overdue if I'm being honest. There's one more thing." What? Dad asked me for $90,000 to save the house. I want that money back. Her face went pale. What do you mean? I mean I spent $120,000 of my own money to purchase your house at auction. Money I could have invested elsewhere. Money that represented years of savings and careful financial planning. I want to be reimbursed for that expense. Jessica, we don't have that kind of money. That's why we were facing foreclosure in the first place. Then you'll pay me back over time. Monthly payments, just like a mortgage. The difference is that now you're paying your daughter instead of a bank, and your daughter is more likely to work with you if you run into temporary financial problems. The implications were sinking in. Instead of losing their house, my parents were going to keep living in it, but they were going to be paying me rent for the privilege. Instead of being financially independent, they were going to be financially accountable to the daughter they'd been excluding from family decisions. "This changes everything," Mom said. "Yes, it does. You're not just our daughter anymore. You're our landlord." I considered this. I'm both. And maybe that's what needed to happen for us to figure out how to respect each other. Mom stood up slowly, like someone recovering from a long illness. "I need to go home and talk to your father about all of this. Take your time, but I meant what I said yesterday. I'll be there for dinner tomorrow night, and I want to see how committed everyone is to making this work." After she left, I sat in my office staring at the list of rules I'd written, wondering if I was being reasonable or vindictive. The line between setting healthy boundaries and wielding power manipulatively was thinner than I'd expected. But for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about whether my family would approve of my choices. I was more concerned with whether I could live with the consequences. That evening, Brianna called from Los Angeles. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other night," she said without preamble. "About power and purpose. And I think you might be handling this exactly right." "Really? Because I'm starting to wonder if I'm turning into someone I don't recognize." "You're turning into someone who doesn't accept mistreatment as the price of family membership. That's not the same thing as becoming a monster." I walked out onto my balcony, looking west toward the mountains where the sun was setting in shades of orange and pink. It feels like crossing a line I can't uncross. Maybe that's the point. Maybe some lines need to be crossed for relationships to become healthier. Or maybe I just destroyed my family by buying their house. Jessica, your family was already broken. You didn't break it by refusing to pretend otherwise. We talked for another hour, Brianna helping me process the complexity of what I'd done and what came next. By the time we hung up, I felt more centered about my choices, but also more aware of how much was at stake. Thursday crawled by with the weight of anticipation. I got updates throughout the day from various family members, texts that painted a picture of intense discussions happening at the house I now owned. From Dad. "Your mother told me about your conversation. We're working on this." From Kevin. "Talk to a realtor about market rate rent. We can make it work." From Uncle Carlos. "Proud of you for standing up for yourself, mija." Nothing from Lisa, which probably meant she was the least happy about the new arrangements. Having to pay rent to her husband's younger cousin while living in said cousin's childhood bedroom was probably not how she'd envisioned their summer housing situation. I left work at 4 and stopped by the title company to sign the final paperwork that would formalize my ownership and establish the legal framework for my parents' tenancy. The documents were thick and official, full of legal language that basically boiled down to me having complete control over their housing situation. Sandra Chen, the title officer, walked me through each section. Standard lease agreement, month-to-month tenancy, option to renew annually. Rent is set at $1,500 per month, which is below market rate for a house that size. I'd deliberately set the rent lower than they could get elsewhere, partly because they were family, and partly because I wanted them to succeed in this new arrangement. This wasn't about financial gain for me. It was about establishing a relationship based on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. "There's one unusual clause here," Sandra continued, pointing to a section I'd had Margaret Henley add. "Grounds for eviction include not just non-payment of rent, but also behavior that creates a hostile living environment for family members." That's pretty subjective language. It needs to be subjective. This isn't just a business relationship. Fair enough. You're the property owner. You set the terms. As I drove toward Scottsdale for dinner, I felt like I was approaching the final scene of a play I'd been writing for weeks without knowing how it would end. The house looked the same from the outside, but everything about my relationship to it had changed. The driveway I'd learned to ride a bike in, the front door I'd walked through thousands of times, the windows of rooms where I'd dreamed about. My future? All of it was mine now in a way that went far beyond childhood memories. Mom opened the door wearing a dress instead of her usual casual clothes, like she was receiving a guest rather than welcoming her daughter home. The formality felt appropriate somehow. We were all trying to figure out new roles in an old story. "Jessica, come in. Dinner's almost ready." The house smelled like roast chicken and homemade bread, the kind of meal Mom made when she was trying to impress someone or smooth over tension. The dining room table was set with the good china, complete with cloth napkins and the centerpiece that only appeared for holidays. Dad stood when I entered the room, which he'd never done before. Kevin and Lisa were already seated, their children conspicuously absent, probably eating earlier in the kitchen to keep this conversation adults only. Uncle Carlos sat at one end of the table, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Should we sit down?" Dad asked, gesturing toward my old seat at the table. Except it wasn't my old seat anymore. They'd put me at the head of the table, in the chair that had always been Dad's. The symbolism was so obvious it was almost funny, but also touching in its acknowledgement of how power had shifted in this family. "Thank you," I said, settling into the chair where the head of the household traditionally sat. Dinner conversation was stilted at first, everyone carefully avoiding the obvious topics while passing dishes and commenting on the weather. But eventually, Kevin cleared his throat and addressed the elephant in the room. "I want to apologize for how we handled moving into your room," he said. "I didn't realize how that would feel for you, and I should have thought about it more." "I appreciate that." Lisa spoke up for the first time. "We'd like to stay for the summer if you're okay with that, but we understand if the rent situation makes it too complicated." "I'd like you to stay, but yes, there will be rent, and yes, there will be some changes to how we handle shared spaces." Dad nodded. "Your mother showed me the list of rules you discussed. They seem fair." "They're not rules exactly. They're more like guidelines for how we treat each other respectfully." "What's the difference?" Uncle Carlos asked. "Rules are imposed from outside. These are agreements we're making with each other about how we want our family to function." Mom brought out dessert, homemade apple pie that she'd clearly spent hours perfecting. As she served it, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about wanting us to be a real family. What does that look like to you?" It was a good question, and one I'd been pondering since our conversation in my office. It looks like inclusion. It looks like honesty about problems instead of pretending everything's fine. It looks like supporting each other's success instead of being threatened by it. And if we mess up? If we fall back into old patterns? Then we address it directly instead of letting resentment build up for years. Kevin looked around the table. "So, we're really doing this? We're going to try to function like a healthy family?" "We're going to try," Dad said. "Though I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what that means." I looked around the table at these people who'd shaped my entire life, who were now looking to me for guidance about how to relate to each other better. It was surreal and overwhelming, and oddly hopeful. "It means we start fresh," I said. "It means we acknowledge that the old way wasn't working for everyone, and we commit to finding new ways that work better." "Even after everything?" Mom asked. "Even after we've hurt you so much?" "Especially after everything, because that's what families do. They figure out how to love each other better." As we finished dessert, I felt something shifting in the room, a loosening of tension that had been present for years. It wasn't resolution exactly, but it was the beginning of possibility. The beginning of a family dynamic based on choice rather than obligation, on respect rather than assumed compliance. Later, as I prepared to leave, Dad walked me to the door. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up on us. For finding a way to save our house and our family at the same time." I looked back at the house that was now legally mine but would always emotionally belong to all of us. I didn't save anything, Dad. I just changed the terms of engagement. Maybe that's the same thing. As I drove back to Phoenix through the desert night, I thought about the conversation at dinner, about the tentative hope in everyone's voices when we talked about doing better. Change was possible, but it wasn't guaranteed. People could choose to grow, but they could also choose to revert to familiar patterns when growth became uncomfortable. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was part of a family that might actually be worth the effort it would take to heal it. And if it didn't work, if they couldn't or wouldn't change, at least I'd know I'd tried everything possible before walking away. The difference was that now, walking away would be a choice I made from a position of strength, not a desperate escape from powerlessness. And that changed everything. 3 months later, I stood in the kitchen of 847 Desert Rose Drive, watching the morning light filter through windows that had framed my childhood and now framed my ownership. The house felt different in ways that went beyond legal documents and property deeds. It felt like a place where people actually lived together instead of just coexisting in the same space. Kevin was at the stove making breakfast for his kids, something he'd started doing after I'd pointed out that expecting Mom to cook for 7 people every morning wasn't reasonable. Lisa was packing lunches at the counter, humming quietly to herself. The domestic scene would have been unremarkable in most families, but in ours, it represented a small revolution in how we distributed labor and responsibility. "Morning, Jessica," Kevin said, looking up from the scrambled eggs. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." "Thanks." I poured myself a cup from the machine Dad had bought after I'd mentioned that the old one made terrible coffee. It was a small gesture, but it represented the kind of attention to my preferences that had been missing for years. Mom emerged from the hallway carrying a laundry basket, her morning routine now including everyone's clothes instead of just hers and Dad's. The adjustment to having a full house had been rocky at first, but we'd developed systems that worked for everyone. "The rent check is on your desk," she said, setting down the basket. Along with this month's utilities breakdown and the grocery receipt split, we'd implemented a transparent accounting system where everyone contributed to household expenses based on their ability to pay. Kevin and Lisa covered their share through a combination of cash, childcare, and maintenance work. Mom and Dad paid their portion along with the monthly rent they owed me for living in the house I'd purchased. It wasn't complicated, but it was fair in a way our family finances had never been before. "How's the job search going?" I asked Kevin as his kids thundered into the kitchen, school backpacks bouncing. "Good, actually. I have a second interview next week with a manufacturing company in Tempe. The commute wouldn't be too bad from here." The conversation was casual, but it represented another shift in our family dynamics. Kevin was no longer just Uncle Carlos's son who needed perpetual rescuing. He was a man working to rebuild his career and support his family, and we were treating him accordingly. Dad appeared in the kitchen doorway, car keys in hand. "I'm heading to the hardware store. Anyone need anything while I'm out?" "Could you pick up those outlet covers for the kids' room?" Lisa asked. "The ones on the list I made?" "Got it." He kissed Mom goodbye, a routine gesture that had somehow become more intentional since our family restructuring. "Jessica, you still planning to come by for dinner Sunday?" "Wouldn't miss it." Sunday dinners had become our monthly family meetings, disguised as social gatherings but structured enough to address any issues before they became problems. The first few had been awkward, everyone still figuring out how to communicate directly, instead of through passive-aggressive hints and assumed grievances, but they'd evolved into something surprisingly functional. After everyone left for work and school, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, handling some client work while enjoying the quiet of the house. This had become my routine on days when I worked from home, using the space I'd grown up in to build the career I'd always dreamed of. My phone buzzed with a text from Brianna. "How's the family experiment going?" I looked around the kitchen, taking inventory of the changes that had accumulated over the past few months. The refrigerator was covered with Kevin's kids' artwork and family photos that actually included me. The bulletin board held a chore schedule that distributed responsibilities fairly among all the adults. The counters were clear of the clutter that used to accumulate when no one wanted to take responsibility for shared spaces. Better than expected, I texted back. Turns out people can change when they have incentives to do so. And you? How are you handling being the family matriarch at 28? It was a fair question. The power dynamic in our family had shifted dramatically, and I was still learning how to wield authority without becoming the kind of person who abused it. There were days when I felt like I was playing a role I hadn't auditioned for, making decisions that affected people I loved, in ways that felt too big for comfort. Some days it's empowering, I replied. Some days it's exhausting. But it's honest, which is more than we had before. The honesty was the biggest change. We'd stopped pretending that dysfunction was normal, stopped enabling behavior that hurt everyone involved, stopped protecting people from the consequences of their choices. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was sustainable in a way our old patterns had never been. That afternoon, I drove to Margaret Henley's office for our quarterly review. We'd set up regular meetings to discuss the legal and financial aspects of my unusual situation, making sure I was protecting my interests while maintaining family relationships. "How are things going with the tenant situation?" she asked, reviewing the rent payment records I'd brought. "Surprisingly well. Everyone's been paying on time, and the house is being maintained better than it was when my parents owned it. Any conflicts over your dual role as family member and landlord?" "Some, but we've developed systems for handling them. Family decisions get made at family meetings. Landlord decisions get made by me after consulting with everyone affected." Margaret nodded approvingly. "You've managed to maintain boundaries while still preserving relationships. That's not easy to do. It helps that everyone has skin in the game now. When you're paying rent to your daughter, you tend to be more conscious of how you treat her." "And your parents? How are they adjusting to the financial arrangement?" I considered the question. Mom and Dad had initially struggled with paying rent to their own child, but they'd adapted once they realized it was no different from paying a mortgage company, except that I was more flexible about payment schedules and more invested in maintaining the property. They're adjusting. Dad's picked up some consulting work to help cover the payments, and Mom's been taking on extra shifts at the hospital. They're actually more financially stable now than they were before the foreclosure. Because they have clear expectations and accountability? Exactly. Before, they were just hoping they could catch up on missed payments someday. Now they have a specific amount due each month to a specific person who cares about their success. After the meeting, I stopped by the storage unit where I'd once found the documents that had changed everything. I'd been slowly going through the remaining boxes, sorting through family memorabilia and deciding what to keep, what to donate, and what to throw away. Today's box was full of old photographs, the kind of family snapshots that tell the story of relationships over time. There I was at various ages, always slightly outside the family groupings, always looking a little uncomfortable in posed shots. There were Kevin's school photos, Uncle Carlos's military portraits, Mom and Dad's wedding pictures from an era when they'd believed in forever. At the bottom of the box, I found something I'd forgotten existed. A handwritten letter from my grandmother, addressed to the whole family but never sent. It was dated just a few months before her death, and it read like a prescription for family healing. "My dear ones," it began, "I've been watching our family struggle with love and resentment in equal measure, and I want to say something while I still can. Love isn't just a feeling you have for people. It's a choice you make about how to treat them. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is require better behavior from the people you care about." I sat in the storage unit, reading her words, feeling like she was speaking directly to the situation I'd created. She'd understood that enabling dysfunction wasn't kindness, that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty, that sometimes you had to disrupt comfortable patterns to create space for genuine connection. Jessica needs to know that her success doesn't threaten our family, it strengthens it. the letter continued. And everyone else needs to know that love isn't about keeping people small enough to need you. It's about helping them grow large enough to choose you. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my purse. Grandma had seen the problems in our family dynamics years before I'd found the courage to address them. She'd understood that my parents' insecurity was driving their treatment of me, and she'd known that change would require more than good intentions. That evening, I returned to the house for dinner, letting myself in through the front door with the key that had always been mine, but now felt different in my hand. The smell of Mom's cooking filled the air, and I could hear laughter coming from the living room where Kevin's kids were playing a board game with Dad. Perfect timing, Mom said as I entered the kitchen. I was just about to call everyone to the table. Dinner conversation flowed easily now, a mix of daily updates, future planning, and the kind of gentle teasing that healthy families engaged in. Kevin talked about his upcoming interview, Lisa shared stories from her new part-time job, and Dad discussed the landscaping project he'd been working on to improve the property value. The difference was subtle, but profound. Instead of competing for attention or walking on eggshells around sensitive topics, we were actually communicating like adults who respected each other's perspectives and contributions. I have something to share, I said as we finished the main course. I found a letter from Grandma today. I pulled out the letter and read it aloud, watching their faces as her words landed. Mom's eyes filled with tears. Dad looked thoughtful and slightly ashamed. Kevin and Lisa exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand the deeper patterns that had shaped our family dynamics. She knew, Mom said quietly. She knew we were messing up with you. She knew we were all messing up with each other, I corrected, and she knew that love sometimes requires uncomfortable conversations and difficult changes. Do you think she'd be proud of what we've done? Dad asked. Of how we've handled this situation. I looked around the table at these people who'd hurt me and loved me, and were now actively working to do better. I think she'd be proud that we didn't give up on each other. I think she'd be proud that we chose to grow instead of staying stuck in patterns that weren't serving anyone. After dinner, I helped with dishes while Kevin put his kids to bed. It was domestic and ordinary, but it was also the kind of family cooperation that had been missing for years. Everyone had roles and responsibilities. Everyone contributed to the household functioning, and everyone's needs were being considered in daily decisions. As I prepared to leave, Mom walked me to the darker. Thank you, she said, hugging me in a way that felt different from the obligatory embraces of the past. For not giving up on us, for finding a way to save our family along with our house. We saved each other, I replied. I just happened to have the resources to make it possible. You had more than resources. You had vision for what we could become. I drove home through the Phoenix night, city lights stretching endlessly in every direction. The desert had been transformed into something unexpected through human persistence and engineering, much like our family had been transformed through intentional effort and uncomfortable honesty. My apartment felt peaceful in a way it hadn't before, not because I'd escaped my family, but because I'd finally found a way to be part of it without sacrificing my own well-being. The view from my balcony included the direction of Scottsdale, where people I loved were living in a house I owned, following agreements we'd made together about how to treat each other with dignity and respect. 6 months later, I stood in the eye. Same kitchen where this story had begun, but everything was different. Kevin had gotten the job in Tempe and was saving money for a down payment on his own house. Lisa had started a small business making custom jewelry, using the dining room table as her workshop in the evenings. Mom and Dad had caught up on all their bills and were even putting money into savings for the first time in years. The house itself looked better than it had in decades. Fresh paint, updated fixtures, a garden that Dad had planted and maintained with pride. Property values in the neighborhood had increased, which meant my investment was appreciating while providing security for my family. But the real transformation was in how we related to each other. Family decisions were made collectively, with everyone's input valued and considered. Conflicts were addressed directly instead of festering into resentment. Support was offered, freely but not demanded or assumed. "I have an announcement," I said during our monthly family meeting. "I've been offered a promotion at work, senior vice president, with a significant salary increase." The response was immediate and unanimous. Congratulations, pride, excitement about my success. No one suggested that my achievement somehow diminished. Theirs. No one worried that my increased income would make me less available to the family. They celebrated my accomplishment as if it were their own, which in many ways, it was. "Does this mean you'll be moving to a bigger apartment?" Kevin asked. "Actually, I've been thinking about renovating the master bedroom here, making it a proper home office where I can work when I need to be close to family." Mom's face lit up. "You want to move back home?" "Not move back. Move forward. There's a difference." The distinction was important. This wasn't about returning to old patterns or reverting to childhood dynamics. It was about choosing to build my future in a place where I felt valued and supported, where my success was celebrated instead of resented, where my needs were considered alongside everyone else's. "We'd love to have you here," Dad said, "but only if it's what you really want, not what you think you should do." That was the key difference in our family now. Choices were respected, boundaries were honored, and love was expressed through support rather than manipulation. We'd learned to be family members who chose each other daily, instead of people who were stuck with each other permanently. As I looked around the table at these faces that had shaped my entire life, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete belonging without loss of self. I was Jessica Torres, successful marketing executive, property owner, family matriarch, and beloved daughter. All of these identities coexisted without conflict, because my family had finally learned to see me as a whole person, rather than a collection of useful traits. The house on Desert Rose Drive was more than just my childhood home now. It was proof that people could change, that families could heal, that love could evolve into something healthier and more sustainable than what had come before. It was a place where I'd learned to use power responsibly, where I'd discovered that boundaries could create connection rather than distance, where I'd found that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable dysfunction. My parents had given my room to my cousin's family without asking, thinking they were solving a space problem. What they'd actually done was create the conditions for a complete transformation of our family dynamics. They'd forced me to stop hoping they would change and start requiring that they do so. They'd pushed me to stop accepting treatment that diminished me and start demanding respect that honored who I'd become. In the end, buying their house at auction hadn't been about revenge or power or even financial investment. It had been about creating a foundation solid enough to support the weight of real love, the kind that required honesty and accountability and growth from everyone involved. The girl who'd once cried in her bunk bed while her family celebrated someone else's achievements downstairs had grown into a woman who could transform pain into purpose, who could use resources to create opportunities for healing, who could lead with strength while still loving with an open heart. Sometimes the only way to save a family is to completely change how it operates. Sometimes the only way to be truly included is to create new terms for belonging. Sometimes the only way to get the respect you deserve is to make it impossible for people to continue disrespecting you. I hadn't just purchased a house at auction. I'd bought my family a chance to become the people they were capable of being. And I'd given myself the power to ensure that chance wasn't wasted. In the process, I'd learned that love without respect is just sentiment, that family without accountability is just proximity, and that sometimes the most radical act of love is refusing to accept anything less than what everyone deserves. The house was mine, but the family we'd built inside it belonged to all of us, and for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.